Within the sacred halls of the Capitol Rotunda, where history itself seemed etched into the very marble, a mere 17 minutes were poised to forever reshape the political landscape. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her spirit forged in the crucible of the Southern legal system and her intellect honed by relentless courtroom battles, stood ready to transmute a brutal personal assault into a breathtaking display of controlled power and unwavering resolve. 42 cameras captured every flicker of emotion, while over 500 lawmakers watched, spellbound, as a single, precisely articulated sentence would strike with the force of a lightning bolt. It was a stark demonstration that the most crushing rejoinder often emanates not from explosive rage, but from meticulous accuracy encased in unyielding calm. This was no ordinary political spectacle. It was a profound inquiry into the resilience forged when a black woman, hardened by the fires of injustice, confronted public degradation designed to shatter her spirit. Instead of collapsing or erupting, she was about to unveil a far more potent force, the uncanny ability to wield an adversary's own weapon against them with surgical precision. While the media remained fixated on the ceaseless Biden-Trump saga, the true conflict unfolding was immeasurably more profound, a titanic clash over honor, deference, and the unbreakable fortitude that surfaces when grace converges with raw passion. The unfolding drama that follows has been meticulously reconstructed from public archives, media accounts, and official records. While certain moments have been amplified for heightened dramatic tension and emotional resonance, every element mirrors the lived experiences of countless individuals who have faced the insidious violence of ridicule, condescension, and calculated malice beyond the public eye. Sometimes, the most lethal instrument in any arsenal is not unbridled fury, but disciplined self-control wielded with deadly exactitude. The Capitol Rotunda, usually a sanctuary of reverent quiet, now throbbed with an electric tension that seemed to electrify the very air. Grand chandeliers cast a ballet of shadows across the gleaming marble, their light catching the glint of military medals, the subtle shimmer of pearl adornments, and the nervous adjustments of impeccably tailored suits. Dust motes drifted like lingering secrets through the golden shafts of afternoon sunlight pouring in through the colossal windows. Every footstep resonated with unsettling intensity. Every hushed conversation seemed magnified, as if the very edifice were holding its breath. Superficially, this gathering appeared to be nothing more than another ceremonial bill signing, a meticulously choreographed display of bipartisan unity for the Educational Opportunities and Excellence Act. The official narrative was one of harmony, Democrats and Republicans converging for the benefit of America's children. Yet, beneath this veneer of civility, something darker stirred. The silence felt too contrived, the smiles too practiced, the gazes too piercing. Certain eyes scoured the assembly not for allies, but for vulnerabilities to exploit. Whispers of an unexpected announcement spread through the press corps like wildfire. Veteran reporters, their instincts sharpened by years of political skirmishes, kept their recording devices active even during the supposed lulls, sensing that an explosive revelation was imminent. Jasmine Crockett occupied her designated seat in the third row of the Democratic section, a portrait of controlled vigilance. She wore no ostentatious colors or attention-grabbing adornments. Her navy suit was impeccably tailored, her posture militarily precise. Yet, there was an undeniable magnetism to her stillness, a coiled energy that commanded attention despite her outward calm. Her seemingly ordinary briefcase hinted at its contents through a partially unzipped opening. Folders in vibrant hues, yellow, blue, red, green, each meticulously labeled. One bore the ominous inscription contingency. Another, simply Melania. Her gold pen glided across a notebook with the precision of a surgeon's blade, her handwriting tight and deliberate. This was not casual note-taking, but strategic preparation, each word a calculated maneuver in a chess game only she could perceive. Her eyes periodically lifted when new figures entered the chamber, when whispers grew too loud, when a Republican aide carelessly activated a microphone that should have remained silent. She cataloged every minute detail, stockpiling ammunition for battles yet to come. To the casual observer, she appeared serene. But those familiar with Jasmine Crockett's courtroom prowess would have recognized the telltale signs. This was her predator mode, the profound quiet before she systematically dismantled her opposition with surgical accuracy. A House aide leaned towards his colleague, whispering urgently, "Why does Crockett look like she's preparing for war instead of a photo opportunity?" What remained concealed was the anonymous warning she had received the previous evening. Not a direct threat, but a chilling intelligence brief. Monitor Melania's prepared remarks. Sources indicate she plans to deviate from script, something targeting Biden personally, designed for viral impact. The message was unsigned, yet the source had proven reliable before. Jasmine had shared this explosive information with no one. Panic was not in her lexicon. Instead, she had done what she always did when confronting an unseen threat. She prepared with ruthless thoroughness. The speaker would begin in 5 minutes. Melania would follow. Jasmine checked her timepiece, clicked her pen once with deliberate finality, and opened a folder simply labeled Dignity versus Destruction. No one noticed the subtle shift, but some would later swear they felt it. That precise moment when something behind those intelligent brown eyes locked into combat readiness. They didn't yet grasp that history would remember this day, not for legislation, but for the moment one woman, quiet and utterly prepared, decided to lie in wait for her opportune moment to strike. The transformation in the chamber's atmosphere was not heralded by fanfare, but by the profound hush that descended as a figure of undeniable magnetism entered the space. Heads turned in a synchronized ripple, recognition spreading from the press section to the political operatives strategically placed throughout the room. Melania Trump had arrived, and she moved with the confident stride of a woman who commanded every space she entered. She didn't merely walk. She glided, her cream-colored dress so flawlessly fitted it appeared to have been sculpted to her form by master artisans. Every step was calculated, every gesture rehearsed to perfection, the kind of movement that commanded attention while appearing effortlessly natural. Camera lenses tracked her progress like heat-seeking missiles, their operators instinctively adjusting angles to capture her from the most flattering perspectives. Her entourage moved with military precision, silent, hypervigilant operatives in matching Navy suits. One clutched a leather portfolio embossed with golden initials. Another scanned the room with the blank expression of a professional bodyguard assessing threats. Jasmine Crockett never turned her head, maintaining her facade of disinterest. But her peripheral vision tracked every movement, every subtle gesture. She had committed Melania's complete political history to memory. Dozens of speeches, hundreds of public statements, every word from the Beat Best campaign. She didn't need to look, for she already knew everything there was to know about her formidable opponent. The contrast between them was stark and intentional. Jasmine, forged in the fires of courtrooms and sharpened by genuine conflict, versus Melania, polished by camera flashes and refined by years of public performance. One carried a briefcase overflowing with policy research. The other held a slender folder containing perhaps 6 pages of meticulously spaced text, rehearsed to mechanical perfection. Yet, Melania's power was undeniable, the kind that stems from being consistently underestimated and then weaponizing that perception with devastating efficacy. She distributed calculated smiles to selected individuals, offered gracious nods to seated officials, and positioned herself near the speaker's aide to ensure maximum visibility. In the press section, a young journalist whispered urgently to her colleague, "She's early." That's highly unusual for her. Another reporter leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Intelligence suggests she's planning to abandon her prepared remarks, something targeting Biden directly. Her team wants a viral moment. The second journalist shook his head skeptically. She wouldn't dare. Not in this setting. The first reporter remained silent, her eyes fixed on Melania, who had now taken her seat 2 rows ahead of Jasmine, perfectly positioned for every major camera angle. She opened her leather portfolio with practiced silence, revealing not one, but two versions of her speech, one with highlighted talking points, another with handwritten annotations in the margins. For one electric moment, Jasmine finally looked up, and their eyes met across the political divide. No smiles were exchanged, no acknowledgments offered, only cold calculation and mutual recognition. Something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that before this hour concluded, words would be spoken that would reverberate far beyond these marble walls, and only one of them was truly prepared for the war about to begin. The Capitol Rotunda, conceived as a beacon of national unity beneath its towering dome, had become a physical embodiment of America's fractured soul. The seating arrangement told the story more eloquently than any speech could. Democrats huddled on the left, Republicans fortified on the right, with an ever-widening chasm of marble floor between them that seemed to expand with each passing moment. Jasmine Crockett maintained her position in Democratic territory, her spine ramrod straight, her gaze fixed forward with laser intensity. She refused to engage in the nervous fidgeting that afflicted some of her colleagues, declined to check her phone like others around her. Her notebook remained open on her lap, her pen positioned diagonally across the page like a weapon poised for action. She understood that this was not mere ceremony, but a complex strategic engagement where every movement carried weight and consequence. Across the aisle, Melania Trump mirrored that same stillness, but her motivation was entirely distinct. Her pose was less preparation than performance. One leg elegantly crossed over the other, hands folded with deliberate precision, a small smile fixed on her lips like a priceless jewel. It never wavered, even as murmurs of anticipation rippled through the rows behind her. The divide between them was more than physical. It represented the vanishing middle ground of American political discourse. In previous years, such ceremonies would have featured natural mingling before the main event, bipartisan conversations, shared laughter, a temporary suspension of rivalry in service of a greater cause. But not today. Today, even body language had devolved into tribal warfare. Republicans spoke exclusively to Republicans. Democrats huddled only with Democrats. A handful of independents drifted between groups like ships without flags, uncertain which harbor offered safe passage. The hostility was not overt but palpable. You could feel it in the strained silences between conversations, in the artificial quality of smiles that never quite reached the eyes. The education bill itself, legislation enjoying rare bipartisan support, should have been the focal point, the undisputed center of attention. But already, that center was crumbling. Aides on both sides studied the seating arrangements with growing anxiety. Press teams whispered about optics and messaging. Someone had noticed the gap, the literal empty space between the front benches of the two parties, and wondered aloud whether chairs should be repositioned for better photographs. A senior staffer shook her head firmly. Let the room speak its truth. The cameras captured everything, but it was the moments before the speeches, the shifting weight in seats, the quick glances over shoulders, the tightening of jaws, that revealed the true narrative. Something was building, slowly and invisibly, like pressure in a sealed container approaching its breaking point. Jasmine's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly behind her glasses. She turned a single page in her folder, the faint sound of paper against paper barely audible, yet somehow cutting through the soft hum of whispered anticipation like a sharpened blade. Melania, position just rose away, didn't move, but her fingers tapped once against her portfolio before falling still again. No words were exchanged, no direct glances stolen, but the tension between them was alive and breathing, imperceptible to most but palpable to anyone who had spent years navigating the treacherous currents of political power. Pleasantries were still being exchanged, opening remarks still awaited, but beneath the surface of civility, something ancient and primal was taking shape. This was no longer going to be just another legislative photo opportunity. The battle lines had been drawn, the weapons readied, and history was about to witness a confrontation that would reverberate through the corridors of power for years to come. The Speaker of the House approached the podium with the measured confidence of a man who had orchestrated this ritual countless times before. His voice carried effortlessly across the marble expanse, each word meticulously modulated for maximum impact. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues, and honored guests, it is my profound pleasure to introduce a woman whose advocacy for children has resonated across our great nation. Former First Lady Melania Trump. The applause that erupted was a study in political theater. On the Republican side, it bordered on triumphant. Several members rose to their feet, clapping with the fervor of soldiers celebrating a victory. On the Democratic side, the response was more restrained, respectful but cautious, the sound of people fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing genuine enthusiasm. Melania approached the podium with her signature grace, a vision of controlled elegance. She offered a practiced smile, paused for precisely the right duration, and began. "Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for that generous introduction," she said, her accent lending a musical quality to her words that somehow made them more memorable. "It is always an honor to speak about something as vital as the education of our children." The opening minutes unfolded exactly as anticipated, a masterclass in political performance. She praised the bipartisan effort behind the legislation, nodded approvingly at the value of cooperation in divisive times, referenced her best campaign with practiced poise, noting that children deserved not only better schools, but kinder communities. From her strategic position, Jasmine Crockett nodded slowly, her expression neutral, but her mind racing. So far, everything was proceeding according to script, ceremonial remarks designed to offend no one and impress everyone with their safe, sanitized message. But then, like a storm cloud suddenly eclipsing the sun, everything irrevocably changed. Melania glanced down at her notes, and when she looked up again, her tone had shifted, still soft, still deliberate, but now carrying something entirely different. A subtle sharpness beneath the silk, a blade concealed in velvet. "Of course," she said, pausing just long enough for the audience to lean forward unconsciously. "For education policies to succeed, they must be implemented with clarity and purpose." Another pause, longer this time, pregnant with unspoken possibility. The room held its collective breath, sensing the impending pivot, but not yet understanding its direction. "Unfortunately," she continued, her voice tinged with feigned concern, "what we have witnessed from the current administration appears to be the product of a flicker of a smile, the barest lift at the corner of her mouth, cognitive difficulties that seem to be worsening with time." The words detonated like a bomb in the hushed chamber. There was no immediate gasp, just a stunned, frozen silence that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, like ripples spreading across still water, the reaction began, a quiet but unmistakable shift in posture across the Democratic side of the aisle. Heads turned toward one another in disbelief. A journalist in the press gallery immediately began typing frantically, her lips parted in shock. Camera shutters clicked into a new, more urgent rhythm, desperately attempting to capture the moment from every conceivable angle. Jasmine's pen stopped mid-word, suspended above the page like a weapon held in check. Melania's voice continued, still calm and controlled, as if she had merely commented on the weather rather than launched a devastating personal attack. But everything had changed in that instant. The temperature of the room, the quality of the silence, the very nature of what this gathering represented. "When the president cannot remember the names of his own cabinet," she said with manufactured concern carefully woven between each syllable. "When he wanders off stage uncertain of his destination. When he must be guided by the hand to find his seat." She raised her eyes, not quite meeting Jasmine's gaze, but coming dangerously close. "How can we entrust the education of our children to such a profound lack of clarity?" This time, the reaction was audible, a stifled cough, a muttered exclamation of disbelief. The press section erupted into controlled chaos, fingers flying over keyboards and devices, recording equipment switching on with urgent clicks. Aides exchanged alarmed glances across the aisle. Somewhere near the back, A Democratic senator whispered sharply to his assistant. Did she actually just cross that line? Jasmine remained motionless, her hands now resting flat against her folder, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. But her mind was racing, cataloging every word, every inflection, every calculated pause. Melania pressed forward with her assault. Perhaps declining test scores in our schools are simply reflecting declining leadership at the highest levels. It was elegant in its cruelty. It was vicious in its precision. And it had been rehearsed down to the very pause, the very breath, the very micro-expression. The room no longer felt ceremonial. It felt like a battlefield where the first shot had been fired, and the echo was still reverberating through the marble halls. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. The atmosphere had shifted from respectful to tactical. Somewhere far beyond these polished walls, a wave was beginning to build, one that no one, not even Melania herself, would be able to control once it reached full force. And Jasmine Crockett remained silent, her stillness now carrying the weighty tension of a coiled spring. For now, the chamber, no longer held together by the fragile bonds of ceremonial politeness, began to reveal its true nature, fractured, divided, and seething with barely contained emotion. On the Republican side of the aisle, several lawmakers exchanged knowing smirks, their body language shifting to the relaxed posture of soldiers who believed they had just witnessed a decisive victory. One congressman actually chuckled under his breath, the sound sharp and satisfied. Their aides scribbled notes, not about legislation, but about this pivotal moment, time-stamping the attack for future deployment in campaign advertisements and political speeches. On the Democratic side, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The lawmakers weren't whispering. They were clenching, jawlines hardened into granite, arms folded defensively, eyebrows drew together in expressions of barely controlled fury. Several looked toward the speaker's podium with silent questions burning in their eyes. Why wasn't he intervening? Why wasn't he redirecting the conversation? Why wasn't he doing something, anything, to restore order and dignity? But the speaker remained frozen in institutional neutrality, his face a carefully constructed mask of official impartiality, though his knuckles had turned white where they gripped the polished wood of his podium. In the third row, Jasmine Crockett had not moved a single muscle. Her spine remained straight, her legs crossed elegantly at the ankle, her hands resting lightly on her folder. But those who had witnessed her in full courtroom combat mode would have recognized the subtle shift, not in posture, but in breathing. Slow, measured, deliberate. For counts in, hold, 8 counts out through slightly parted lips. Her face revealed nothing, but her mind was already dissecting each word, each pause, each rhetorical weapon that had been deployed. This wasn't merely a spontaneous insult. It was a structured assassination attempt, draped in designer clothing and delivered with practiced precision. Melania hadn't stumbled off script. She had marched deliberately into the lion's den and thrown raw meat into the center of the arena, fully aware of the carnage that would inevitably follow. And Jasmine had seen it coming. The previous evening, her chief of staff had forwarded an anonymous message, brief and signed, but from a source that had proven reliable in the past. Trump's inner circle seeks viral content. Monitor Melania closely. May target Biden personally. Prepare your evidence. That was all. No timestamp, no sender identification, just a warning shot across the bow. But Jasmine hadn't needed more information. She had remained in her office long after the city lights began twinkling outside her window, files spread across her desk like battle plans, transcripts pulled from archives, quotes verified and cross-referenced. Not for aggression, but for defense. Not to attack, but to reveal truth when lies were deployed as weapons. She hadn't known what form Melania's deviation would take, but she understood that the former First Lady had never truly abandoned the art of performance politics. This chamber, with its cameras and ceremonial dignity, was too tempting a stage to resist. Now the attack was unfolding exactly as predicted. The audience stunned into silence, the press feeding like sharks, sensing blood in the water, and Melania, calm, confident, possibly even proud of her surgical strike. Jasmine inhaled again, deliberately and slowly. She didn't blink. She thought about her father, about dignity under assault, about the cruel whispers that followed illness like vultures. She remembered how some people saw only weakness where others saw humanity, and how they weaponized perceived frailty for political gain. This wasn't just mockery. It was warfare disguised as concern, designed not only to wound Biden, but to cast doubt on the very concept of compassion itself, to transform human vulnerability into political liability. And Jasmine Crockett had just become the only person in that room prepared to respond with equal precision and infinitely greater moral authority. But not yet. The moment hadn't arrived. She would wait, patient as a predator, until the perfect opportunity presented itself. Melania Trump closed her leather portfolio with a whisper-soft sound of expensive materials meeting, her final words still hanging in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. She offered that same curated smile, that perfect blend of serenity and superiority that had been refined through years of practice, and stepped back from the microphone with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had just delivered a masterpiece of political theater. The applause that followed was a study in division. On the Republican side, it erupted swiftly and sharply, several members rising to their feet with the enthusiasm of spectators who had just witnessed their gladiator land a killing blow. On the Democratic side, the response was sparse and uncertain. A few obligatory claps, exchanged looks of disbelief and disgust. One senator folded her arms and refused to move at all, her silence more powerful than any protest. The speaker returned to the podium, his expression neutral to the point of visible discomfort, wearing the face of a man forced to pretend that civility still existed when the very foundations of decorum had just been dynamited. He offered a small nod to the crowd and cleared his throat with obvious difficulty. "Thank you, Mrs. Trump, for those thought-provoking remarks," he said carefully, each word chosen with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. Then, after a pause just long enough to signal transition, "Next, we will hear from Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of Texas, who played a pivotal role in shaping several of this bill's equity-focused provisions." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the room held its breath. Then, with movements so controlled they seemed choreographed, Jasmine closed the notebook on her lap. The motion was smooth and deliberate. No urgency, no theatrical flourish. Just a soft press of her palm, a single click of her pen being capped with finality. And then silence. As she rose from her seat, there was something mesmerizing about the way she unfolded to her full height. No exaggerated gestures, no glances at the crowd for approval or intimidation. She simply emerged like someone rising from deep, still water, calm, deliberate, and utterly unshaken by the storm that had just passed over the chamber. Every eye in the room turned to track her movement. She adjusted her glasses slowly, not from habit, but with purpose, a ritual of preparation that those who knew her recognized as the final step before she entered full combat mode. Then she gathered her folder, slid her pen into her jacket pocket with military precision, and turned toward the aisle. Each step she took toward the podium seemed to carry more weight than the last, not because of fear or uncertainty, but because of what she carried with her. In her folder wasn't just policy research or prepared remarks, it was ammunition. History, precision, memory. She walked not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, diminished, or mocked under the pretense of legitimate political discourse. The only sound in the chamber was the rhythmic tapping of her heels against marble, each step echoing like a countdown to something inevitable. The room felt suspended in time, like a breath held at the very top of the lungs. Reporters stopped typing. Several forgot to lift their recording devices. Members of Congress leaned forward, not out of politeness, but out of something deeper, anticipation mixed with dread. They had witnessed the wound being opened with surgical precision. Now, they were waiting to see if someone, anyone, possessed the skill and courage to respond with equal force. Jasmine reached the podium and placed her folder down with deliberate care, aligning it perfectly with the edge, one hand positioned on each side, her shoulders square and unwavering. Melania sat in her designated seat, several rows back, her smile unchanged, but her posture slightly more rigid now, like someone who had suddenly noticed the temperature in the room dropping to dangerous levels. Jasmine looked up, her gaze sweeping the chamber once with unhurried precision. She wasn't seeking approval or measuring opposition. She was calculating the space, the silence, the weight of the moment, the distance between herself and what had just been unleashed. Then she leaned toward the microphone, her voice steady, warm, and unmistakably firm. "Thank you, Mr. Speaker." And in that moment, everything began to change. Jasmine stood at the podium for several heartbeats longer than protocol required, not frozen by uncertainty or intimidated by the moment, but calculating with the precision of a master strategist. She didn't adjust the microphone height. She didn't shuffle through her papers. She simply gazed out at the assembled crowd as if to remind them that silence, too, could be a weapon of devastating power. When she finally spoke, her voice carried layers of warmth that could lull an opponent into complacency before striking with lethal accuracy. "I came here today," she began, her words measured and deliberate, "to speak about education, about classrooms filled with possibility, about opportunity that should be available to every child, and about what this legislation means for communities like the one that shaped me." She paused, allowing her words to settle like sediment in still water. A few lawmakers nodded, perhaps grateful for what seemed like a return to safer, more conventional territory. But Jasmine's tone carried no promise of safety, only the certainty of truth, regardless of its consequences. "But silence," she said, allowing the word to hang in the air like a sword suspended by a thread, "in the face of cruelty disguised as commentary, is not an option for me." The reaction was immediate and electric. The room didn't gasp, it crystallized. Conversations that had been quietly resuming froze mid-whisper. Eyes sharpened to laser focus. Pens hovered over notepads. Melania's head tilted just slightly, like a predator suddenly realizing she might have misjudged her prey. Jasmine allowed the silence to stretch until it became almost unbearable, then continued, not louder, but with crystalline clarity that cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "I've spent most of my adult life in courtrooms, where decorum matters deeply, but so does fundamental human decency. And I've learned that sometimes, when someone crosses a line that should never be crossed, the most dignified response is to hold up a mirror and force them to see their own reflection." With that declaration, she reached up and slowly, deliberately removed her glasses. The gesture, so simple it seemed almost mundane, sent ripples of electricity through the chamber. It wasn't theatrical. It was intimate, vulnerable, intentional. It transformed everything. Without the barrier of those thin black frames, her gaze landed with devastating directness, more human and more exposed, as if she were stepping out from behind the armor that every public servant learns to wear just for this crucial moment. "I'm not here to engage in a contest of insults," she said, her voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "And I'm certainly not here to defend a man who is more than capable of defending himself, both in word and in action. But I am here to defend a principle, a boundary, a line that was crossed today with calculated precision." Melania didn't move, but her lips compressed almost imperceptibly, the first crack in her facade of serene confidence. Jasmine's tone remained level, refusing to rise to the bait of retaliation, and yet with each carefully chosen word, she began reclaiming not just the room, but the very moral foundation upon which civilized discourse rested. Not by overpowering her opponent, but by grounding the entire discussion in something deeper than political point scoring. "There is a difference," she said with the authority of someone who had witnessed both sides of human nature, "between disagreeing with policy decisions and attempting to diminish someone's fundamental humanity." That line struck like a gavel, bringing order to chaos. People weren't just listening anymore. They were leaning forward, drawn into the gravitational pull of her moral clarity. She glanced down once at her notes, then back up, making eye contact with no one in particular and everyone simultaneously. "I've learned," she said with the wisdom of someone who had fought battles in courtrooms and corridors of power, "that when your position has genuine strength, you don't need volume to make your point. When your argument carries real weight, you don't need venom to make it sting. What you need is clarity. What you need is truth." There was no flourish, no finger pointing, no theatrical denunciation. Just precision and restraint wielded like surgical instruments. And an unmistakable message that resonated through every corner of the chamber. You brought performance art. I brought perspective. You deployed weapons. I brought wisdom. As the moment stretched and deepened, it became clear to everyone in the room, and to those who had watched this confrontation unfold across the nation, that Jasmine Crockett had not come to respond in kind to the attack that had been launched. She had come to fundamentally alter the terms of engagement, to raise the stakes from political theater to moral reckoning. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. Her power emanated from pace and precision, the kind of deliberate cadence born not from political calculation, but from years of courtroom cross-examination, where every word could determine the fate of justice itself. Her voice, though soft, seemed to cut deeper with every carefully crafted syllable. "I've listened with great attention to today's remarks," she began again, her eyes now fixed not on Melania, but somewhere above the assembled crowd, not avoiding confrontation, but elevating the entire discourse to a higher plane. And as I absorbed those words, I couldn't help but be reminded of other statements. Words spoken from this very same voice, but delivered in a very different spirit. She turned a single page in her folder, the sound crisp and decisive in the chamber, now held captive by absolute silence. The gesture was deliberate, methodical, like a prosecutor presenting evidence that would prove beyond doubt the case she was building. May 7th, 2018, Jasmine read with the precision of someone quoting scripture. "At the launch of the Be Best campaign, Mrs. Trump stated, and I quote exactly, 'We should strive to provide kids with the tools they need to cultivate their social and emotional health and teach positive ways to communicate online and in person.'" She paused just long enough for the irony to penetrate every corner of the room, for the contradiction to become undeniable. In October of that same year, she continued with relentless precision. In an interview with ABC News, she stated, and again I quote verbatim, "We need to have more tolerance for different people with different beliefs, be more kind with each other, and respect each other's origins and beliefs." The silence in the chamber deepened and sharpened, transforming from mere quiet to something that hummed with the electricity of realization. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't smirk. Her expression remained as focused and unwavering as a surgeon applying pressure to stop bleeding exactly where it was needed most. In April 2019, she continued with methodical determination. Mrs. Trump posted on social media, and I quote, "I encourage everyone to be kind to each other and treat each other with respect in everyday life and on social media." Republican aides began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. One leaned over to whisper something urgent to a colleague, but stopped mid-sentence, the words dying in his throat. A press photographer quietly adjusted his lens to focus on Melania, whose smile had not disappeared entirely, but had become visibly strained, the corners of her mouth held in place by sheer force of will rather than genuine emotion. Jasmine placed the printed quotes gently back on the podium, aligning them with perfect precision, as if sealing them into evidence for a trial that was already reaching its verdict. "I don't mention these words to mock them," she said, her tone softening slightly though never losing its razor-sharp edge. "I mention them because I believe they mattered when they were spoken. I believe they were sincere, or at least intended to be meaningful." She allowed her gaze to return to the audience, sweeping slowly across the chamber like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. But words, especially from those who hold positions of influence and authority, don't exist in isolation. They are markers. They are standards. They are promises. And when we violate the very principles we once stood upon, when we weaponize health conditions, age, or human vulnerability for political gain, we're not just contradicting ourselves. Her voice grew stronger, more resonant, carrying the weight of moral authority that could not be manufactured or performed. We're teaching our children a dangerous and destructive lesson: that empathy is conditional, that respect is strategic, that human dignity is negotiable based on political convenience. A murmur of agreement, faint but unmistakably present, moved through the left side of the chamber. Even several center-leaning Republicans appeared visibly uncomfortable, studying their programs or examining the floor with sudden intense interest. Jasmine held the room without demanding it, commanding attention through the sheer force of moral clarity rather than political manipulation. This education bill is supposed to be about what we teach our children, what example we set for the next generation, what kind of future we're actively shaping through our words and actions. And if we're to hold our children to standards of kindness, of maturity, of emotional intelligence and strength, then those standards must begin here, in this chamber, with us. She reached slowly for her glasses, sliding them back onto her face with deliberate ceremony. The symbolism was subtle but unmistakable. She wasn't retreating behind them for protection. She was completing her argument, fully armed with the clarity that comes from moral certainty. And the room, once filled with political confidence and partisan certainty, was now quiet with something far more powerful and unsettling: the recognition of truth and the uncomfortable weight of accountability. Jasmine stood in profound silence for what felt like an eternity, allowing the weight of her previous words to settle deep into the consciousness of everyone present. She could feel the quality of attention in the room. No longer the restless energy of people waiting to respond, but the focused stillness of individuals genuinely listening to understand rather than simply to react. She turned another page in her notes, but kept her eyes on the assembled crowd, scanning faces with deliberate slowness. Something more personal was coming now, and the subtle shift in her tone was almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human and vulnerable. "I want to share something with you that most people in this chamber don't know about my life," she said with quiet authority. "Before I ever ran for public office, before I ever stood behind a microphone like this one, before I ever imagined I would have a voice in these halls of power, I was simply a daughter." Her hands remained steady on the podium. Her voice didn't tremble even slightly, but it carried something new and profound: the weight of lived experience and personal memory. "My father," she continued with reverence that filled every syllable, "was a mathematics professor, a man of brilliant intellect, dry humor that could make you laugh when you least expected it, and endless patience with students who struggled to understand concepts that came naturally to him. He could solve complex equations in his head faster than most people could write them down. And for the longest time, I believe there was absolutely nothing he couldn't figure out, no problem he couldn't solve." A few heads in the audience tilted slightly, the beginning of emotional engagement forming behind previously guarded expressions. The chamber was transforming from a political battlefield into something more intimate and human. But in his later years, Jasmine said, her voice carrying the weight of painful memory, he began to change. Slowly at first, forgetting the names of colleagues he'd known for decades, losing his way through mathematical problems he'd once solved with his eyes closed. Then the changes came more rapidly, more dramatically. She took a deliberate breath, not for emotional control, but for emphasis, allowing the gravity of her words to resonate fully. "I watched a man who had once taught calculus to generations of eager students struggle with the simple task of tying his shoes. I watched people begin to talk around him instead of to him, as if his condition had somehow made him invisible or less worthy of direct engagement. I watched judgment slip into rooms before he even entered them, saw people make assumptions about his worth based on his symptoms rather than his lifetime of contributions." Her eyes remained steady, unflinching, as she continued. "But never, not once during that difficult journey, did I see his fundamental worth diminish. His dignity remained intact. His character stayed strong. His contributions to his family, his academic field, his students, his community, none of it was erased or diminished by his medical condition. A subtle, rustling moved through the chamber. One aide near the back lowered his eyes in what might have been shame. A Republican staffer who had smirked earlier now stared rigidly ahead, his expression completely unreadable. And that, Jasmine said with the authority of someone who had witnessed both the best and worst of human nature, is the line we are called to defend. Not just as politicians engaged in partisan warfare, not just as public servants representing our constituents, but as human beings with consciences and souls. Her voice didn't rise in volume, but it deepened in resonance, carrying the kind of moral weight that could not be manufactured or performed. I'm not standing here to score political points or win news cycles. I'm standing here because I've seen what it looks like when someone is reduced to nothing more than a collection of symptoms. I've witnessed the quiet cruelty of mockery wrapped in polite tones and delivered with practiced smiles. And I've seen what it does, not just to the person being targeted, but to the people watching, especially young people, especially our children who are learning from our example. The chamber had become completely still, not with the stiffness of political tension, but with the reverence that comes when truth is being spoken without artifice or agenda. She leaned forward slightly, not to press her advantage, but to offer her final words as plainly and directly as fundamental truth itself. Dignity, she said with quiet finality, isn't something we request from others. A beat of silence. It's something we demonstrate through our own actions. The words hovered in the air like a verdict delivered without flourish, carrying only the weight of absolute moral clarity and the unmistakable ring of justice finally served. The silence that followed wasn't the stunned quiet of shock, but something deeper and more profound. The kind of reverent hush that falls when truth has been spoken with such clarity and moral authority that argument becomes impossible. Then, slowly, deliberately, applause began to build. It started on the left side of the chamber, not thunderous or triumphant, but steady and purposeful, the sound of recognition rather than celebration. The clapping spread gradually, growing in volume and intensity, but carried a different quality than typical political applause. This was acknowledgement. This was respect. This was the sound of people recognizing that they had just witnessed something rare and precious in the modern political landscape. Authentic moral leadership delivered without calculation or artifice. Several members of Congress on the right side of the aisle didn't join the applause immediately. Some never did, but they didn't look away either. Their silence spoke volumes, not necessarily agreement, but an inability to dismiss what they had just heard. By the time Jasmine stepped back from the podium, the applause had filled the entire rotunda, echoing off the marble walls and soaring ceiling. It wasn't just appreciation for political theater. It was acknowledgement of something far more significant, and something more difficult to define. A collective reckoning with the standards they had allowed to slip, the boundaries they had permitted to be crossed, the dignity they had failed to protect. What had begun as a routine photo opportunity had become a rupture in the very fabric of political discourse. The chamber would return to its business. The bill would be signed with appropriate ceremony. The official proceedings would continue, but nothing would feel quite the same again. The ceremony proceeded, at least in its external form. The speaker returned to the microphone, his voice carrying a slight tremor that hadn't been present earlier, thanking Congresswoman Crockett for her profoundly moving remarks. He paused, perhaps searching for solid ground after the emotional earthquake that had just reshaped the landscape of the entire gathering. And now, he said with forced normalcy, we move forward with the signing of this truly vital legislation. The official bill signing felt almost anticlimactic, a mere formality after the raw emotional and moral drama that had just unfolded. The ceremonial pens, the flash of cameras, the carefully staged photographs. It all seemed muted, distant, like echoes from a different world entirely. Lawmakers lined up according to protocol, some still visibly shaken by what they had witnessed, others wearing strained smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Melania Trump, her composure remarkably intact despite the devastating counterattack she had just endured, signed the document with her characteristic flourish, her hands steady and controlled. But her eyes, though still carefully composed, held something new and unreadable. Perhaps surprise, perhaps a dawning realization of the weapon she had inadvertently forged through her own miscalculation. Jasmine Crockett signed the bill with the same deliberate grace and precision with which she had spoken. As her hand lifted from the document, she didn't seek out Melania's gaze for a moment of triumph, but instead swept her eyes across the entire chamber, taking in the faces, absorbing the silent reactions, measuring the lingering tension that still charged the air. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of a gotcha moment or political victory lap. Only quiet, resolute strength and the satisfaction that comes from standing up for principles that matter more than political advantage. As the ceremony concluded, the chamber began to stir with renewed energy. The orchestrated smiles and polite chatter resumed their familiar rhythm, but the atmosphere remained fundamentally altered, charged with an electricity that hadn't been present when the day began. Reporters, their notebooks filled with frantic scrawl and their devices loaded with footage that would dominate news cycles for weeks to come, immediately began moving through the crowd like sharks sensing blood in the water. They converged on aides and lawmakers, desperate for quotes, reactions, any fragment of insight into the extraordinary confrontation they had just documented. The surprise statement that Melania's team had orchestrated had indeed achieved viral status, but not remotely in the way they had intended or hoped. The narrative had been irrevocably shifted, transformed from a calculated attack into a masterclass in moral leadership and the power of dignified response to personal assault. Outside the rotunda, the Capitol seemed to exhale, the afternoon light softening into early evening as the political world began to process what had just occurred. But for those who had been present in that marble chamber, the memory of those 17 minutes would linger like a brand burned into consciousness. A stark reminder of the fragile line between legitimate political discourse and personal destruction, and the profound power of dignity when confronted with its opposite. In the days and weeks that followed, the confrontation would reverberate across the entire political landscape like an earthquake whose aftershocks continued long after the initial tremor. The Educational Opportunities and Excellence Act would indeed be remembered for its bipartisan support and its potential impact on American education, but it would forever be intertwined with the day a calculated insult met an immovable force of moral clarity, and the true cost of weaponized words was laid bare for an entire nation to witness. The footage of Jasmine Crockett removing her glasses, her voice calm and steady as she systematically dismantled a performance with unwavering truth, became more than a viral moment. It became a touchstone, a reference point for what authentic leadership looks like in an age of manufactured outrage and calculated cruelty. Commentators would debate, and analysts would dissect every word, every pause, every gesture. Public opinion would fracture along predictable lines, yet with a newfound intensity that suggested something fundamental had shifted in the national conversation about the boundaries of acceptable discourse. Melania Trump's team would initially attempt to control the narrative, issuing carefully crafted statements that framed her remarks as merely observational and motivated by genuine concern for the nation's future. But the stark contrast of Jasmine Crockett's measured response, her personal story woven seamlessly into a defense of universal human dignity, resonated far more deeply with a public weary of political vitriol disguised as patriotic concern. The subtle shifts in body language captured by dozens of cameras, the palpable discomfort of Republican lawmakers, the speaker's visible struggle to maintain institutional neutrality. These visual cues, amplified by endless replays and social media analysis, spoke volumes beyond any carefully crafted press release or damage control effort. For Jasmine Crockett, the incident would solidify her position not just as a sharp legal mind capable of devastating cross-examination, but as a moral compass in an increasingly fractious political climate. Her quiet strength, forged in the crucible of systemic injustice and honed through years of fighting for the voiceless, had been revealed to a national audience hungry for authentic leadership. And in the hushed corridors of the Capitol, where power is measured in whispers and influence flows through invisible channels. The memory of that afternoon would serve as both inspiration and warning. In the arena of political combat, the most formidable weapon is not always the loudest voice or the most vicious attack, but the unwavering courage to speak truth with precision and the quiet, unshakable strength of grace under fire. The 17 minutes that transformed a routine ceremony into a defining moment of moral clarity would be studied, analyzed, and remembered long after the specific policy details faded from public memory. It had become a masterclass in the difference between performance and principle, between calculated cruelty and authentic strength, between the politics of destruction and the power of dignity to transform even the most hostile environment into a space where truth could finally be heard above the noise.